Hello, checking in again with another chapter of The West Beyond the West by Jean Barman, History of British Columbia. This is Chapter 7, Population Explosion, 1886 to 1914. There's a old picture there of it's Victoria at the time of the First World War with the Empress Hotel and the new Parliament buildings. A little bit more built up now, but yes, that's what it was like there. And actually, yeah, those two buildings are still in existence, though with many additions. So yes, we're going from 1886 to 1914, where there's a population explosion. Where, God, lots of numbers in this thing. It's what is this? The population explosion beginning with the Canadian Pacific Railway and culminating with the First World War, because everything got kind of frozen there, transformed British Columbia. First seemingly becoming a Canadian province and then reverting to a British orientation. In reality, British Columbia had a way of making newcomers its own. Geography and economy helped to determine the patterns of settlement, and which were unlike the rest of Canada. British Columbia, a location at the end of the line, literally and figuratively, brought together peoples that might not otherwise have shared a common space. At the same time, topography combined with prejudices of the day to encourage distinctive ways of life. To the extent a sense of community emerged, it was often equated with the locality, a Gulf island or a coastal inlet, the Nicola Valley or the Kootenays. Some arrivals, Chinese, Dutch, Chinese, Doukhobors, Mennonites, middle-class Britons, sought to maintain their old ways. Discrimination isolated British Columbians from one another. The entity known as British Columbia largely remained a political abstraction. There had been a thing of like, oh, we're getting more just Canadians for people from other places in Canada emigrating to BC, but then with a kind of push for emigration happening, a lot of Brits ended up coming to British Columbia in particular as a viable thing, and not kind of like those like either they were misinformed about farming or were interested in other things. But it's very much kind of one of these things of like there was like an actual British Columbia accent, which is like sort of more British than the British of the time, which is kind of funny because my parents, who emigrated in 1960s, passed on to me maybe slight traces of accent. Perhaps it's probably died with age and not being around them anymore. There is the whole thing of like, just exactly how omnipresent Chinese people were, mostly Chinese men, as laborers, as cheap exploited labor by a lot of the kind of the upper classes, middle class using them as kind of servants. I think the thing is houseboys. If I was living here in Victoria, and I was a middle class person in the 1890s, you would have a house servant. And indeed, there's some sections in here where there's middle class women kind of extolling the benefits of having such kind of cheap labor. You also have the Japanese coming in, a lot of them coming through Hawaii, where they were used as labor there, and then coming through to the Straits. We also get the first of this book says East Indian, what is now called South Asian. A lot of Sikh people coming from India, going into the logging resources thing, where apparently in India Sikhs were sort of loggers there as well, so it was a kind of a good transfer. At the same time, there is also tons of racism. There's definitely a thing of like almost kind of it's a class warfare thing where the super rich are exploiting these Chinese and other immigrants who don't speak the language and are easily exploitable to get super low wages, push them into jobs that supposedly white workers wouldn't take, which is so instead of being angry at the rich assholes like Dunsmuir and people like that in their coal mines, it's like, no, we're going to be were going to be super racist towards the Chinese and the Japanese and the South Asians coming in. Um, and the province's population doubled over the first decade of the new century to almost 400,000. And while part of that growth was due to natural increase, most of it resulted from federal immigration campaign launched in 1896. Now the big thing with a lot of this emigration is that the people that were there already wanted it to be white. They did not. There was a lot of concerns about basically it's what was called the yellow peril of this swamping the white supremacist British Columbia, and you get stuff like the Asian Exclusion League. There is a riot in 1907 where they basically rampaged through the Chinatown and were fought back. Where you get quotes from like Prime Minister Laurier using racist terms to describe Japanese people, saying that they beat them back, but they have so much pluck. We're going to have to take measures against them anyways. And indeed, they cap immigration to it's like 400 a year. And you have what's quite a famous incident in British Columbia of the Kamagata Maru incident. Apologies, where a wealthy Sikh gentleman actually wanted to challenge kind of the immigration laws, hired this Japanese freighter to bring in, 376 prospective Sikh and Punjabi Muslim immigrants to Canada via Hong Kong. And they refused to let them in. They refused. They turned them back. They ended up back in back in India, where they tried to board the ship and arrest kind of the leaders. A riot ensued, and like 20 people were killed. It's one of these shameful blots on Canadian history. It's a good sparking point example of that racism towards the South Asian community. So, and was apologized eventually by our up to our Prime Minister in Parliament, like 2016 or something like that. It doesn't say that here. It doesn't actually mention that they also ended up back in India and were, shot and arrested and stuff like that. There's this whole thing of just sort of the racism, and I mean there is the sort of the class thing of like the lower classes showed the most kind of violent and vocal stuff. The upper classes less so, because probably they seem to be benefiting from the racism, the exploitation of these people coming in. But I think also quotes Peter Ward in White Canada Forever, of this kind of yearning for a racially pure society. There's this idea that we want to keep it all the same and preserve and have a pure race. It's white supremacism, and it's just it's like, but also this anxiety that they're going to outcompete us, even though supposedly the white people are the superior people, and it's basically comes down to being, no single explanation suffices to explain the antipathies that so long existed, because it's not reasons, it's racism, it's irrational, those tribal fears, and just kind of making the point that a lot of the people in the lower classes were extremely unstable, how unstable their lives were, that they were continually like resource communities. It's like it's on contract. You always had employers basically willing to toss you out if you tried to demand any rights. We're always looking for the cheapest labor. Thus, we get into that. There's some things here about like how there was even areas where they said they had to make agreements with cities that they wouldn't allow Asian immigrants into the mills because they would actually preserve jobs for white people, because if you're not white, then we can pay you a ton less, and of course at the same time, all these people's